was told this morning I was doing this, so I was like, well, Holy Spirit, what's the topic? Because I've got nothing to say. And the thing that really just dropped in my spirit was capacity. So I'm going to talk today about your leadership capacity. And it's funny because I hear a lot of questions about capacity, especially I think as an internship, as people get different roles, figuring out how to structure life. Man, I just feel like, how do I become a big capacity person? What does that even mean or look like? So hoping that today kind of helps address some of those things and just maybe speaks into it a little bit for you. So I was, little fact here, I was a political science major in undergrad and have a master's in public policy. So all things political. I wanted to be the chief of staff for the President of the United States of America. Here I am. God had other plans. So one of the things that I always found interesting when you talk about poli-sci is you have these nation states, these countries, and the question that you're often studying is what does a country, what they do or don't do, right, is all boils down to three things. It's whether they have the power, the will, or the capacity to do it. So when you think about power, that's do they actually have the ability to take that action? So it's an authority thing. Do they have the power within them to actually go and execute whatever it might be that they're trying to do? So when I think about power off the back of Pastor Audrey's message yesterday, that authority piece of how often do we actually go and take the authority that Jesus has given us, right? And so I think that's sometimes where we get stuck is that we haven't actually stepped into that power, that authority that Jesus has given us. But once I feel like we do that, there's a second layer that we have to kind of talk about before we get to capacity, which is the will. And will is this decision or an initiation of an action. I actually desire to do this. I'm going to do it out of the will. I'm actually going to take this step. So when we would talk about nation states, they have the power. Do they actually have the will? Do they want to make that action or come to aid of another, country, whatever it might be? So when you think about it, it's have I stepped into that power, that authority? Do I actually have the will? And does that actually align with God's will? Is a question you actually have to ask yourself. And then I feel once you've been able to address those two, you actually get stuck. Often that roadblock next is a capacity thing. And capacity is actually your maximum amount that something can contain or really even produce. So do you have the capacity to contain what you need to or to produce what you're being asked to or perform, to yield, even the capacity to withstand that grit, right? Sometimes it's I just have to see it through the season. That's a capacity thing, right? As much as anything else. And so when I think about addressing your leadership capacity, I think I wanted to frame it with those three things because I think often we get to capacity and it's just I'm maxed out. I don't have the capacity. But really there's a lot of other layers happening here to capacity. And so I think if we can first cap it off of all right, Jesus has literally given me the authority and the power to outwork this purpose in my life, right? That he's being asked to, whether it's this role, this career, whatever it might be, I can walk in that authority that he's given me. The will, do I actually want to be doing this? And I think you have to continually ask yourself that. And it's not a once and forget because I signed up for internship or I said yes to this role that my leader asked me to do. It's you continually have to heart check that space and be do I have the will to do that? And then capacity is okay, do I actually have what it takes to contain that or produce it? And so that's where I want to dig in a little bit more on what does that capacity piece look like? And Pastor Audrey referenced a part of this verse yesterday, I believe, but 1 Corinthians 3 talks a lot about the fact that we often get started on milk, spiritual, milk, and then as we grow in the faith, we can be introduced to solids, real meals, things like that, right? You can layer that in. I think our capacity is similar, that often we start with a little something and it feels like a lot, right? When I think about EVA growing, she's now 9 months, like the amount that she used to eat before was like an ounce at a time.
Right.
And now she could, she can eat some solids, she can have, a whole 8-ounce bottle of milk. Like she has the ability now, that capacity to contain more. And I think that as we are growing in our leadership in a role, or even just, you could talk about spiritual faith, there's a lot there that I think we sometimes get stuck in the fact that this is how I've always done it. And so I haven't really gone outside to stretch that capacity, or even to test if there's more to grow into here. And I think that what Pastor Audrey spoke yesterday was pretty challenging. There was a part that was like, hey, you've been doing this for so long, it's time now to kind of to go for more, to bite off another piece. And I think that often in our capacity, sometimes that's in one camp, it's like, well, we've just always done this, so the thought of adding more feels overwhelming until you kind of take it off a little bit at a time. And then other times I think we get thrown into something new and we're like, oh, wow. Like I haven't prepped my capacity plate, if you will, for what I just entered into. So now I'm kind of backpedaling to be like, what will it actually take to sustain and withstand in what I'm carrying, that leadership that God has given me, right? And so I'm going to kind of talk about 3 different sets of things, so 6 total here, but the first 3 I'm going to talk about as like a leadership locate. So let's locate a few things about our leadership that I think will help us in this, like, do I have the capacity to do, God, what you're asking me to? The first is your heart. Locate where your heart is and don't stop doing it. I think that in some of the seasons, I think about when I first started serving at People Church, I was on the connections team, which is like all things foyer at this point because we were much smaller. So like coffee team, doors, connectors, everything was one team. So in a Sunday, you could be asked, oh, go behind guest services. Back then we had a guest service table. Or it could be like, oh, hop on doors this week. Or, oh, you're going to brew the coffee this week. And I think about there are times when I would be like, oh, God, why did I get the short end of the stick? And now I have to do coffee this week. And it's like we had one pot of coffee, like this urn that you filled up. And then once it was done, like you were just out. So then you had the people that came late and they're like, there's no more. And it's like, literally, this is my only pot of coffee that I can make coffee in. So once it's done, you had to go clean it and then start it again. But it takes a long time. It basically takes the whole service to get it ready for the after service thing. So every day when I get stuck on hospitality, is my world is stuck, God one day came from my heart and was like, stop saying you're stuck on hospitality. You have the ability to serve here, is what I'm asking. So how are you serving the people with hospitality? Your attitude is not hospitable. It's like, take your stupid coffee and move on. It was like where my heart was, right? And so I had to basically check my heart and the capacity, because then once I feel like I actually was like, okay, God, my heart is not in a good place about what I'm being asked to do this Sunday, that the whole capacity part, it no longer felt hard or difficult. It was like there was a new joy to it of like, wow. It was almost like I can now get ahead of the fact that okay, we're probably going to run out at this time. And so then I can strategically go, clean it, get it started, and we'll be ready just in time for when service comes out. But when I was bitterly ugh, just take it, it was like I didn't care enough to think about how to improve it. It was just like, you had it, whatever, you'll get it when you get it again. But when my heart posture changed, it actually turned into wow, I could see so much more of how this was a gift. How do I make this hospitality, right? How do I be hospitable, make this a whole experience, right? And so I think we have to continually check our heart posture, because it's directly linked to our capacity. If your heart's in a place where it's just man, I don't care about it, or maybe I care so much that I'm so emotional that I'm taking everything so personally now. And it's I actually have to let go of some of that and give it back to God, because it's not about me. And I'm making it too personal and too about me. Now I'm so emotional that it's actually restricting me a bit. And so I think there's so much tied up in our heart posture for our capacity that we continually have to locate, okay, where is my heart in this season for what I'm doing, how I'm serving, even I think in our career at roles. There were years of the stock market where I was like, God, why can I leave yet? Because there would just be days where you're just getting screamed at and you're like, this is just, I can only take so much of this. And God being like, every day, I think Pastor Chris says it so beautifully at Growth Track, like, they're your environment to impact. And it was like, how's my heart coming into this? Am I letting it get me calloused and cold? Or am I showing up still open to these people who I could easily be like, you screamed at me one too many times in the heat of the moment because you had 30 seconds and I was going too slow, I get it. And then be like, I don't want to talk to you, right? Or be like, hey, like, things get intense. That's the nature of this job. But I'm still going to be like, hey, how was your weekend? How's your family doing? Like leaned in. And I think making sure that we don't let our heart get calloused in what's, I think that's so easy to do as the world hits us. So heart locate is the first thing. The second thing for leadership locate is your mind. So I think so much more is a mental thing than we actually think about capacity. We think our way out of so much. And it's like that analysis paralysis sometimes where we think about our perception of what it's going to take to get something done, that we automatically go into like a freeze mode of like, I'm supposed to do what? That's too much. Again, capacity. I don't have the bandwidth for all of that. Versus, I think that mental toughness is like, okay, there's a lot of unknowns here that are making me go into like a fight or flight mode here of like, oh, am I going to suck at this because I've never done it before? So I'm just going to back away versus being like, wow, this is an opportunity to grow in something I've never done before. It's actually going to test my capacity. And so I'm actually going to have to test my mental ability to withstand that, again, that self-doubt that comes in, those thoughts that creep in of like, man, I'm not eloquent enough to be asked to do a rally. I'm not eloquent enough to figure out, how to phrase that group study or even to facilitate a group study, to be a grow group leader. Man, I'm not wise enough to sit in front of someone and disciple them. I think there's so much that we mentally talk ourselves out of. And so to actually continue to locate, where's your mind set and how protected are you against the enemy's lies? Because I think we go into autopilot so much. I can think about so many seasons in my life where like you think you're good, right? Because you're like, oh, we're doing this. And then the Holy Spirit would be like, you've kind of gone on an autopilot mode. And it's all kind of become a little bit of like a status quo, like we're doing it and it's fine. And the Holy Spirit, like, what's the next innovation piece to this? What's the next person that you're raising up here? How are you reshifting and realigning like team in this season? Because I think all those things, again, are directly related to capacity. Because something I've found is like, if you don't stay ahead in that like strategy space, it's going to catch up to you at some point. And so capacity, I think, is that ability to say, okay, God, maybe I'm already at like that bandwidth of that capacity that it's like my current season, but always thinking forward to like, all right, again, back to that analogy, like I'm drinking this much milk, God, but what are you going to be asking me next? And how am I prepping for that season? And always having that leadership mindset of like, okay, I need to locate, am I still so stuck in the here and now that I haven't thought about the future to come? Or on the flip side, I'm really stuck in the past and it's limiting everything in the present, that I haven't been able to move past. I'm still thinking about conversations that happened a year ago or whatever. Again, so maybe that trickles into like, I'm just stuck and I'm afraid to test it again. I'm afraid to go again. So actually locating that leadership, I think, where is our mindset on certain things? Because again, that's all connected. Heart, mind, because what we allow in our mind is only a matter of time before it sinks into our heart and grows roots that are so much harder to get out. So keeping that uncluttered in our leadership, I think, is directly tied to what we have capacity to do. Because when those things get cluttered, man, we stop moving. There are seasons, I think, that I could have moved faster had I been a bit more like in sync with like that mental and heart space. That it was like I was just like you get busy doing the practicals, and God, the Holy Spirit's asking you like, okay, this is a great season. Everybody always does like end of year, like process. I think one of the things to go back and look at is like, okay, am I really clean in that heart and mind space right now? How is that maybe caught up to me a lot at the end of the year? Yeah. And how do I now go forward in a new year and think about how do I keep it uncluttered all year long? Yeah. Pastor Chris says it great of just like continually doing those a week review or whatever it might be, of just like kind of going through and reconciling those pieces, I think are directly related to like how fast we can move, or even how well we withstand what's coming against us at any season. Yeah. And then the third thing in that leadership locate is our spirit. And I differentiate this because I think we can have the same heart posture, we can have the same mindset as people around us, but if the spirit isn't aligned, if the spirit's not in sync, everything else goes off. Yeah. And I think we have to continually think about how plugged am I to you, God? How good am I at abiding in you? Yes. Because I think when we stop really abiding in him, the spirit gets off so quick. Yes. And it's just the little things. It's like, again, a bit of a like, well, I don't know about that, God. That cynicism kind of creeps in, or that like skepticism. Or even it's just like a little bit of an attitude of like, I don't know. And so I think being able to locate like, hey, where's my spirit on this? And how good am I at taking it back to God and asking him to like search me and make sure that I'm still really, I think, that closeness. Because without him, I think that's the thing that's like the mystery of capacity is like, without God, it should be impossible. Yes. Like, it should always feel like I'm not able to do this on my own. Yeah. And I think people try to get too practical of like, oh, a big capacity person means that like I can do this on my own. Right. And I just need to upskill and I need to like learn different things. But I think to really find that like, when I think about some of the biggest capacity people, I think it's about how good they are at asking God. Yeah. That prayer, that leaning on God, at putting it back in his hands and being like, okay, God, I don't know what to do with this. I'm not strategic enough. I'm not creative enough. I could never do this on my own. I couldn't hustle hard enough for this, but I'm going to give it back to you and let you move on behalf of it. You create the momentum, God. You move. You give us the next strategy to put into place, because I'm not brilliant enough for that. And I think that's where you really unlock a lot of what it really looks like, that big capacity, because I think that's where he's able to give you those God strategies and God momentum that you can't create on your own. Yeah. And I think that's directly tied back to like, where is our spirit in this? And so those are the three things to locate in leadership. And then lastly, I just have three like leadership stock take. So as you look at like your current leadership capacity, I think that there are three things that you got to ask yourself. The first is, am I capped? Capped being, I think, there are seasons where our capacity feels capped, where we're at a ceiling to it, or almost like if you want to use the plate analogy of like, I've got so much on my plate, I can't keep it going, or like it feels too overloaded. And so when you feel capped, I think it's asking God and taking that stock take of like, okay, God, is this actually in this season, I'm just capped at what my current capacity can hold, and then praying into that and asking God, okay, how do I need to shift this? How can I either, like expand this plate, if you will? But I think some of that is like recognizing, like, do I feel capped? Yeah. Because that's the first part of just knowing, like, where are you currently with that? And then the second thing to locate is, am I being stretched? Yeah. So I think there's a difference between being capped and being stretched. Yeah. Capped feels like there's nowhere out. It's almost like you feel closed in, and you're like, man, God, I've got to figure out if this is a me thing. Most of the time it's us thing, right? It's like you either need to like go to God and be like, okay, again, heart, mind, spirit, where am I at? Or like, how do I figure out what I need to hand off to you?
Right.
What do I need to just pray into and help you move? Maybe it's team moves, like whatever it might be in that leadership season. It's like actually locating what in your leadership needs to shift so that things can get uncapped a bit. Stretching feels different to me because stretching feels like I'm in it, but it hurts. It's like capped feels almost like you want to shut down in some ways, and you're like, okay, God, help me. But like stretching is like this rubber band that's like, man, how far can I get pulled before I snap, in a sense, right? And I think recognizing if you're in a season that feels like it's stretching, asking God to like guide you through that season, because I think those seasons tend to be the seasons where people want to quit too prematurely. And so I think asking God, okay, how do I grow with the stretching that you're doing in my life? So if it's like, again, I just think about, man, I could think about this season of my life. Becoming a mother is very stretching, and you can't quit. So this is like, right, that's it, right? So it's like, you got to figure a way out, like a better way forward. I'll phrase it that way. So it's like you're actually getting stretched in a way that you're like, I have to undig some capacity in me. I got to undig some more grit, some more like strength to be able to say, okay, how do I need to better utilize like what I have, and even God, like grow my capacity, make me someone who can go from the milk to the solids, like that I have a hunger to do that. And I think that stretching is like, when you locate that, there's got to be a sense of like, okay, I'm being stretched, I want to get stretched with it. So it's kind of that growth over comfort value, right? How good are we at saying like, okay, I'm actually going to value this growth season, this stretching season. I know and recognize it's not going to be comfortable, but I'm not going to like let the discomfort take me out. And so in this, I can recognize like, all right, God, I expect to see my capacity grow, that when I look back at this growth season, I'm going to say, wow, God, I actually have the capacity to withstand a whole lot more than I used to, mentally, physically, whatever it might be, emotionally, spiritually, like more mature about different things. I think it's even the practicals of like, wow, God, the things that used to be able to come at me that would stress me out, now I'm like, okay, let's take a breath and let's organize some stuff, right? And find a way forward, better delegation, all of those things I think heighten in that stretching. And so I think that capacity, leadership capacity there, that's a great place to like take that stock take and ask God, like, what are you trying to highlight here for me to grow in? And then the last and third thing would be the leadership stock take of realignment. So is it the fact that my capacity isn't capped or isn't stretched? It's just simply not prioritized right.
Ooh, wow.
Like, I could do everything I'm being asked to do. I'm just not doing it well. Because I've got some mismanaged priorities that, like, and maybe that's just simply because life has continued to grow. I think there are seasons where naturally alignments, like, or priorities kind of realign. You get married, there's some realigning that happens there. You have kids, there's realigning because you have to say, okay, there are some priorities that just ticked up a little bit, or like something new entered the picture, then now I got to realign. It doesn't mean that anything came off my plate. I just have to figure out how to do this better. So how to actually realign my capacity so that it actually outworks what I, again, have been given the authority to do. I have the will, hopefully, to do all those things in my life that I'm like, man, God, you asked this of me. How do I actually outwork this? And I think the realignment is us continually asking, like, okay, God, what is it that maybe in my life I don't have the right prioritize here? I think when I look back at like my single years, I'm like, I did a lot, and I think I did a lot well. And I think now I realize, like, dang, I had so much time that I didn't realize that I had. And there were times where I'm like, but man, I maxed out my calendar. If you were to look at those last couple of years before I got engaged, there I was working full time, volunteering, a lot of stuff. And I can look back and say, like, God, man, I did what you were asking me to do in that season of my life. But I think something that I realized I had to continuously do was reshift and reprioritize and say, okay, God, in this season, is this still the thing that you're asking me to carry? And something that I talk about from a strengths thing, if you want to bring that in, is those of us that have responsibility as a strength are going to struggle with some areas of capacity when it comes to like saying yes or even letting go of things. Because you take such ownership that I think when you are coming through like a capacity realignment, something that's very real is like you've taken so much ownership of what you've been asked to do, what's on your plate, that capacity thing, that to let go of it almost feels like slightly like a personality, or not a personality, like an identity thing, because you're like, I did this thing, like, and I'm like really owning it, and now you're asking me maybe to hand that off, to delegate. It's like, wow, God, okay, like I gotta unpack maybe a little bit of like, oh, I was actually letting that like become my identity a bit too much. But I think that's a raw responsibility to know that like, okay, God, in this season, if that's what you're asking, I need to hand it off. But we struggle to let go sometimes because it's like you've taken so much. And I think knowing that there's going to be seasons in your leadership that God's going to be reprioritizing different aspects of your capacity. And so much so that I think as like when we talk about leadership, there are certain seasons, right, where it feels like a lift and shift kind of thing. And it's like suddenly maybe you get put in charge of a serve team, whether it's like kids, oh, now you're going to lead this age group. And suddenly it's like, oh, amazing. But then maybe you get shifted somewhere else. And you're like, oh, but I took on so much in this space, it's like hard to let go of. And I think where you have to watch out for is like, did I bring up someone that I could hand that off to? That stewarding and delegating thing. And I think that's part of our leadership capacity, to be able to say, okay, God, knowing that in seasons, what's on that capacity plate might change. I need to be ready to know, what do I need to realign, and always be open-handed with it. To be like, okay, God, if you ask me to realign this, I'm willing to do it. Help me figure out how to do it. And I think that goes for like, even responsibility people, it's like saying yes is very hard because, again, you take a lot of ownership. So you're like, if I say yes to this, this is how it's going to impact this, and this. And so I think, again, not letting yourself overthink it. I think really checking and locating that stock take of like, okay, what might have to realign in this way? And then if I'm realigning, how do I best do that? Is it, again, I need a bigger team now. I actually, like, now is a great time to look at my 2IC and be like, oh, as my leadership is being asked to maybe stretch or grow, it's also someone else's time too, right? And I think being able to like look at that and see how, I think those opportunities in that space. And so those are just some of my thoughts about capacity. And I think knowing that in every season, we can never just like set it and forget it and be like, okay, God, this is where I'm at. This is what you've asked me to do. But knowing that in every season, we've got to continually check, like, am I walking in that authority God asked me to? Is my will still there, aligned with his will? And then in the capacity thing, am I checking my heart, my mind, my spirit? And am I actually stock taking, like, am I getting capped? Am I being stretched? Am I realigning? Like, there's all these things that I think we got to continuously have a pulse on, because otherwise I think we fall in that, like, that danger zone of, like, I'm going to suddenly feel so overwhelmed with my capacity that I want to give up or quit or say I can't do it and miss out on things that God's actually asking us to do. And so I think that's, like, when I think about big capacity people, I think those are the layers that are happening underneath. It's not just somebody's like, oh, well, you can just carry a lot. You got big shoulders to carry it. But it's all these layers underneath that actually impact how they're carrying it, why they're carrying it. And ultimately, God, I'm carrying it for you. So it all falls back on you. Those moments where I feel like, God, I don't have the capacity to do this. I mean, what was it? 2 years ago, we were put on exec. That whole year, I don't know about you, but that whole year was like, what is, like, okay, this is the new role. I'm responsible for that too? Shoot, okay. And us looking at each other and be like, all right, we got to figure this thing out. And it was helpful to have like Gio and Eva in that season to be like, okay. I think there was a lot of realigning on how we had to lead, because like you're actually asking us to lead more. And I don't think any of us felt like our capacity was ready for it yet. It was kind of like, and I think Pastor Chris and Audrey knew that. And so they were really great at like the amount of meetings that would be like, okay, what are we struggling with this week? Like, what's the holdup? We're like, we don't know. We've never done this before. A lot of our things we've never done this before. We don't know. And so him like helping, I think, teach us how to reshift our life and our teams and our priorities to actually step into this role that he was asking us to do. And so I think that's the thing with capacity is sometimes we find ourselves in roles that we're like, I'm not big enough for this, but people see it on our life because they see what God's called you to. And again, it should always feel a bit scary of like, I don't know that I can carry this without you, God, because I think that's where you're in the like perfect zone with it is like, I never want my leadership to feel like I can do it on my own. Because the minute that I feel like, oh, I've got this, I become very nervous about what the enemy's having a field day in my teams because I've, again, gone asleep on the fact that like I need to be actually like mindful of it all and like asking God, okay, where is it that I should be covering in prayer? Really asking in your strategy and wisdom on. If I start doing it in my own like skill set and strength, there's a lot there that I can move, but then I always hit the like, man, it is moving on my momentum, which is so slow. And like, God, could you just come in and take over here? And so I just really want to encourage you guys that whatever it is, work, volunteer role, just life in general, you're trying to balance grocery shopping and laundry, like asking God, like, okay, how do I do everything that is like mine to carry? And how do I do that to give you glory? So yeah, that's my staffy thought. I guess I'll, 15 minutes for Q&A if you want it.
Oh, I have a question. I'm kind of processing. Thanks everyone for your time. I'm a processor. One of my first questions though that's coming up is like, you started to talk about it, Shannon, but I would love to hear more about how you have like engaged your leaders as you're navigating through different seasons of capacity, and maybe even like how you engage your peers, like what was helpful and what's your like advice on how to best engage your leaders and your peers.
So leaders and peers. So I think I'll start with peers. I find peers to be the best sounding boards for when you're in a season like that, because sometimes it's like they see things that you can't even articulate yet. You start to like share with them like what you feel like you're struggling with, and they're actually like, well, yeah, because this and this, like, why don't you think about reshifting this, or like do like a org structure. Like Eva's one of the best people at this because I feel like she comes up all the time and it's like, guys, like here's what I'm like stuck on, right? And I think it's with your peers, like having that almost if you were like that board of advisors in a sense, like those peers that get, again, like they're on the same like spirit with you, the same like mindset of like they really want to see that win, and like, but also it's not a peer of like comfort. They're not just gonna agree with you of like, yeah, it's hard, man, dang, you sure you want to be doing all of that? Like people who are actually gonna challenge and like help find those blind spots for you. That handful of people, maybe it's 2-3 people to like kind of almost, we call it like a whiteboard session of like, man, this is just where I feel very stuck, or like, yeah, I'm feeling the stretch this season. And that they can speak encouragement, they could speak like guidance to it, they could even speak like, I think just the truth of like, yeah, because you really haven't been doing so great. Like what else is going on? Because sometimes I think it helps uncover that it's like, it's actually nothing practical. It's all like, you seem like you're just in a funk. And we got to work out what's actually happening. And then I think sometimes it's like all that shifts, but really being able to like almost spew across it. I think there's a safety in like spewing to those people who like are those trusted confidence that we used to have this joke of like, I guess it still kind of exists of like, we're not gonna quit. It's like having those days where it's like, this week has been really hard. I don't know about you, but like, dang, this has been hard. Because I think it allows like those, again, the thoughts of the enemy or those lies not to settle in of like, this is just how it's going to be and it's always going to be hard and like, you should just give up now, or you're not good enough for this, go back to what you were doing or whatever. Like it's, all those things that can creep in. I think from your leaders thing, I'll do it twofold. Like, I think your leaders, the ones that are like, right, that you're under, again, it's that always spewing up first. So sometimes I use my peers as like that sounding board of like, I actually have to locate what's going on in my own headspace so that I can better articulate it to my leader.
Yeah.
Because if I bring it to him in this raw state, I'm not quite sure what I'm still processing. So sometimes that peer is helpful to be like, help me outwork a bit of it. And then I could take even that raw piece to my leader and be like, I'm stuck here. Help me really outwork this. And like, where can it help me figure out how to go forward? And I think your leader is the best at being able to say like, all right, a growth plan of like, yeah, I see that. Okay, what we can do is X, Y, Z. Or like, man, yep, you need a project manager. Or like, wow, you're really just doing too much and you need to delegate. Or, hey, you realize that's not actually your role? And so maybe you should not do that and do this instead. And so I think like having that sounding board is great too. And then I would say like those that you are leading, the way to kind of, I think, especially if it's becoming a season where you feel like, okay, things are starting to have to lift up a season. I feel like we've, through the years of People Church, have felt different growth points at different seasons where it's like it's growing. Suddenly we go from, 100 to like 300 people. The system structures all change with that. I think something that I've seen through time at People Church is like we're always shifting and innovating based on the people, because it's all about the people. Yes. So if what we're doing isn't helping connecting people to Jesus and Jesus to people the best, it keeps shifting. Yep. And so I think something that as a leader, that as you start to feel those growing pains of church coming back, like we are growing and we're growing week over week at this point, it feels like, that recognizing like, okay, how we're running is only going to last maybe 3 months at this rate. Yeah. And then we're going to be feeling a really tight pinch because we're not ready and equipped for the growth season coming on the other side. Yeah. So really prepping your leaders with that of like, hey, growth season's here. This is how we need to be thinking and like building teams. We need to be recruiting in different places. We need to, whatever it might be, like rethinking our strategy on these things and kind of like helping prepare their hearts and minds for that too. And I think in that, they're also like, okay, as they level up and maybe you're asking, I'm going to be handing off things to you. It also means like they've got to think about structuring their team as well. And so it's that trickle down. And I think you do those first things first, right? Talk to your leaders, soundboard with your peers. And then with that, you kind of have a plan to outwork how might that impact my team that I'm leading. I think again about like when we became execs, it was like, okay, the way we're currently running is not at that level. So it's basically us trying to take a new role while doing everything we used to do. So now we had to get strategic about, there's actually 4 new roles that I need to create and find great volunteers to fill. And I think those things do impact it. I think what's beautiful about that though is like usually in those seasons, it's when people actually finally get to step into what they've always wanted to do, because the opportunity finally opened up. Before it was like we weren't big enough for it, or like, it just didn't exist quite yet. And it's like really fun time to see as it grows. It's like usually that person that's like, man, I've always felt called to do that. And the opportunity just wasn't there because we're holding on to it ourselves, right? So it's a really great season, I think, to empower and equip people. So that would be my long answer to your question.
Great. I guess I'm just curious about like any thoughts or examples that you've had around a growth plan. Like, because you've been doing leadership development, like what's one maybe that comes to the top of your mind that is a testimony of something that like has worked really well, or what is the growth plan, or how have you seen it outworked?
So typically for those that know, growth plans are usually like you're kind of reviewing what's currently happening for a leader on their team, how they're outworking it, and it's basically all about where do we want to go in the next 3 months, in the next quarter. And growth points are always like, okay, if we want to see you maybe with like, take this team from, car park would be a great example. Let's just use that as an example. there's like 2 people on car park because we're, you guys have more now, but like think about it, it's like, okay, you get thrown in, there's no existing team. So your growth plan is pretty simple. It's like build a team, right? That's literally what you're trying to do. But the plan is all about like how you're going to do it. So maybe 3 quick points of like a growth plan might be like, okay, active recruitment. That might look like growth track. How are we actually like getting in front of new volunteers coming in and pulling them in? It's like, even I think for some teams, it's a bit more like, okay, what are the actual roles that I need to fill? And going and like jotting those down as like who am I actually trying to recruit and how am I doing it? I think someone who's done that really well over the year is actually Maddie with creative team. 2 years ago, it was like creative had what, 2 film editors and like maybe 3 with Ming, and it was like even that I think Ming was brought into the team in that season because there was such a severe need for it. I think creatives had, by like just sheer need going all online, it was a bit of a like for survival we need more people, right? Like, and I think what they did really well is in that season I've watched them like create, like if I think about last growth track, they had so many people sign up for creative, more than any other team. Why? Because they know like, okay, these are the people we need, and they're just constantly out there trying to find them. And I think that's someone who can like highlight a good growth plan of like, all right, Sarah did that amazingly last year. Kids team coming back off the back of pandemic had just a handful of kids volunteers. She went to God and prayed the heaven down to find volunteers. She was posting in every channel I think possible of like, hey, you got kids? You like kids? Anyone want to sit and like just watch some kids? Like we have fun, and I think being intentional about like making it a team that was attractive for people to join. Both kids and creative have done a great job with that. And so I think those are really good things with like that from like a more, I'll just quick do like a personal like, I think there have been growth plans that I've seen that have been more, I won't give out names, but like more about like the internal outworkings, right? Spiritual confidence, boldness has been kind of a reoccurring of like, it's not necessarily that it's like they're handed a role and a team, and on paper they would thrive in it. But in reality, maybe they're really struggling. And in talking to them, it's highlighted that like, man, you just don't believe quite in your ability to do it. You still feel a bit like, oh, me, God? Like, wow. Or it's a bit of that, like, haven't really taken that authority yet, or really known, I think it's that empowerment. There was a lag of like, you're given it, but have I stepped into like, I'm empowered to do it? So I think about some of those individuals, it would be like, just kind of outworking it with a bit of timidness, or like not having the confronting conversations that need to be had. And so sometimes those growth plans just simply look like, how are we going to coach you in these next 3 months on those things? So in the day-to-day, when those problems arise and we're like, all right, here's a great chance for you to walk in that thing we've been working on, you're going to go have that same page conversation now with this individual, even though they would prefer you go do it. You're like, nope, this one's going to be you to go have it. Or it's like, hey, you still got up there with the mic and you just sounded really unsure of yourself. So let's run that play back. And like actually see like, are you confident in what you're going to say? How do you prep beforehand? So I think all of that kind of works in like those pieces. And I think it's just, if I were to boil it down, it's like, you got to know where you're trying to take them in those 3 months. And then you just kind of work backwards from there of like pinpointing. We try to keep it simple. 3 things that like, if we work on for the next 3 months, we'll get closer to what we're asking you to grow in. And so don't overcomplicate it. Again, the strengths team is they're trying to like also help you utilize your strengths to outwork what they have. So sometimes it's like, man, you've got really great executing strengths. Your team is so disorganized. So let's use those strengths to put some organization in line here, right? So that's like some of the practical that outworks is. But yeah.
So great.
Yeah. Awesome.
I don't know if I have a question, but I just feel for me that this message is so timely, and I couldn't put words to what I was feeling, like the shift in my life, because so I have like this project management business and then church, and thank God like project management me, so like, praise the Lord, but like, it's like full on now, and so I like, they're both like literally so full on that I was like, oh my gosh, this is a lot, and I knew that I could do it, but I wasn't sure like how to prioritize all of it.
Yeah.
And literally like, it was literally last week that I was like, oh my god, actually I have to realign. And so this really puts words to like everything that I've been feeling, and so don't necessarily have the answers on how I'm gonna do it, but like this has just been so timely, the realignment, like, and then even the stretch and cap, like, that's very good, because I fully feel stretched, but I'm like, okay, like, how do you, like, realign? Obviously bringing God into everything, but I think there's so many practicals that you just kind of, like, I freeze, and I have responsibility also in my top 5, so I'm like, but I said yes to everything, so I have to do it well, and it's just, like, not possible. So something Pastor Oggs told me, like, a long time ago was, like, what are your cloth balls and what are your rubber balls? And so I'm really, like, evaluating that in this season as well.
Yeah. And I think just as like a last encouragement, like it should be taken as like a compliment, I think, when your capacity is tested. I think often we think we're failing as a leader when we suddenly feel like, oh, my capacity is not up to par here, or like I'm really struggling with this. I think that when we feel that, it's actually like almost a testament to like we've really been going hard, and there's more, and maybe again we have to shift. I think it's like we should be taking it as like, wow, this is a place where I can grow in my leadership, in my personal life with God, right? And not as a like as a sign that like, oh, I failed and here I am again at this roadblock of capacity. I think we need to take it as like, wow, I'm hitting up against capacity again. Wow, God, okay, I'm going to pay attention to what you're telling me here that I can learn, that you're highlighting, and take it as like almost that, it should be like a sign of like, wow, okay, this is good, versus I get nervous if it's like I'm running for 3 years and I never feel like my capacity's tested. I get nervous there because, again, for me, I fell on autopilot. Right. And I think everything's great, but if I were to really look at it and keep a pulse, I should probably be concerned that like, that I'm still running at the same, and I think that is all good. And so I think capacity stretching and capping and realignment is like a sign of growth. And so it should be an encouragement of like, wow, God, okay, I'm leaned in, and like, what do you want to teach me here? And how can I learn and grow in this? And I think it's the testament on the other side when you come across and you're like, that ease of like, wow, I feel good about this again, and like you can run off that momentum and be like, wow, because then you can look back and say like, wow, look at all that growth, God, that you just showed me. And like I think that's where you can really look back and say like, I'm not the same leader I was 2 years ago. And again, that should be encouraging versus like that like, oh God, like, because I don't want to be the same leader I was a year ago, 2 years ago, for the sake of the people I'm leading, because they're probably like, come on, like, let's get this moving a little bit, or just like, I don't want to get stuck on a ceiling. I always want to say, what's next, God? What more can there be? So, just an encouragement. You guys are doing great. I'm excited to see and hear all the things in the months to come of just, you guys grow into the next thing for you that God's calling you to. I've watched so many of you in this last year just grow in amazing ways too, which is really, really encouraging. I think coming back fully into Clemente, it's been cool to see different leaders rise in this season and really step up. So really proud of you guys. And excited for the future.
Let's go.